lone rancher for years, until he rescued an Apache woman dragged through coach. John McAllister had not seen another soul in years. The vast plains around his ranch stretched endlessly, golden grass swaying in the wind, broken only by the distant line of mountains and the occasional gnarled tree. Life had taught him to rely on himself, and after the tragedy that had struck his family, he had little reason to trust anyone else. The accident, though years ago, still haunted his thoughts at the quietest moments of the night. He could remember the sounds of the storm that took his wife and children, the crack of lightning, and the roaring flood that swept away the small cabin where they had lived. Ever since that day, he had chosen solitude over companionship, silence over conversation, and the steady rhythm of the land over the uncertain ways of townspeople. His days began long before sunrise. The chill of the early morning air nipped at his face as he saddled his horse, brushing it carefully while thinking about the work ahead. Each task had its order. First, he checked the fences. Years alone had taught him that a single broken post could lead to a stampede, or lost cattle. He walked mile after mile, hammer and nails in hand, repairing any weakness he found. Sometimes he wished he had someone to talk to, someone to share the long, quiet hours, but the memory of loss kept him silent. The wind was his only companion, carrying with it the scent of sage and the faint trace of wild flowers that bloomed along the edges of the prairie. After tending to the fences, John moved on to the cattle. He had raised these animals almost as his children, knowing each one by name and by temperament. He could tell when one was sick or unhappy, and would spend hours coaxing them, feeding them, and making sure they were safe. Even the smallest moments gave him purpose. When a calf nuzzled him or a horse leaned its head into his shoulder, he felt a brief warmth in his chest, a reminder that life could still have small joys, even when it had taken everything else. Lunch was simple, usually a piece of bread with some cheese, or occasionally he would cook up some beans over the open fire. He had long ago learned to make do with what he had, hunting small game when meat was needed, storing supplies carefully for the harsh winters. He was frugal, not out of greed, but out of the knowledge that the land could be unforgiving. The winters could come suddenly, blanketing the plains in snow, cutting off travel for weeks. Supplies ran out quickly if not managed wisely, and John had learned to survive. The afternoons were reserved for repairs around the ranch. Sometimes he would fix the roof of the barn, patch up the water troughs, or mend the saddles and harnesses. He moved with precision, a man used to long hours of hard work, finding rhythm in the repetition. Despite the solitude, there was a quiet satisfaction in the daily labor. Each completed task, each repaired fence, each satisfied animal was a small victory in a world that had once taken everything from him. Evenings brought a different kind of quiet, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. John would sit on the porch of his cabin, a cup of strong coffee in hand, listening to the wind whistle through the plains. Sometimes he would pick up his old guitar and strum softly, the melodies echoing across the empty fields. Music had always been a comfort, a bridge to the life he had lost, and even if the notes seemed hollow in the vast emptiness, they reminded him that he was still alive. The nights were the hardest. Darkness carried memories he could not escape. He would lie in bed, staring at the low ceiling, hearing the creak of the cabin settling, and feel the weight of loneliness pressing down. Occasionally, he would hear the howl of a coyote in the distance, or the rustle of an unseen animal moving through the grass, and for a brief moment he would imagine he was not entirely alone. But most nights, the silence returned, heavier than ever, until sleep finally claimed him, if only for a few hours. Despite the isolation, John was not a man without hope or without purpose. The land demanded respect and attention, and in meeting its needs he found a kind of quiet fulfillment. He understood every nuance, the direction the wind blew, the softness of the soil after rain, the way clouds moved across the sky. Each season brought its own challenges. Spring meant new calves and planting, summer meant tending to the grass and water, autumn brought the harvest, and winter demanded endurance and careful planning. In these cycles, John found a sense of order, a rhythm that soothed the chaos of his inner life. Occasionally, he would think about the town beyond the hills. He remembered the market days, the laughter of children, the gatherings at the saloon, but those memories felt distant, almost like a story he had read long ago. He had been a part of that world once, but now it belonged to others. John had chosen the plains, the open skies, and the freedom of solitude over the noisy, unpredictable lives of townspeople. The townsfolk, in turn, had given him a reputation. Some admired his self-sufficiency, calling him a strong, capable man. Others whispered about him with suspicion, wondering why he had cut himself off from the world. But John paid little attention to their talk. The land was his companion, and that was enough. Yet, even in the midst of solitude, life has a way of reminding a person that they are never truly alone. John sometimes saw the occasional bird hovering above the prairie, or a deer passing silently through the trees at the edge of his property. These small encounters brought a sense of connection to the world, a reminder that life continued beyond his cabin walls. And though he rarely spoke to anyone, these moments filled a quiet corner of his heart, a corner he had long thought closed. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the shadows grew long, John noticed something unusual on the horizon. A dust cloud rising in the distance moved too fast to be the wind alone. His instincts, honed by years of living in the wilderness, told him to pay attention. He squinted against the fading light, trying to make out what was causing the disturbance. At first it was just a flicker, a movement barely visible, but then he saw the unmistakable shape of horses and a carriage struggling against the wind. Something was wrong. John's heart began to beat faster. He had not known anyone in years, had not been drawn into conflict or danger, and yet here was a problem that could not be ignored. The thought of someone in distress, of being able to help, brought a spark to his life that he had not felt in a long time. For the first time in many years, John felt that he might not be completely alone in the world, and that perhaps the solitude he had chosen might be interrupted by something that mattered. As night fell, the dust cloud became clearer against the dimming sky. He could see figures moving frantically, the chaos of the moment evident even from a distance. His hands gripped the reins tightly, and without hesitation he urged his horse forward, galloping toward whatever danger awaited. The familiar routine of ranch life faded behind him, replaced by a surge of adrenaline and the unexplainable certainty that he was about to step into a story much larger than the quiet days he had known. For years, John had lived by the rules of isolation, trusting no one but himself, relying on the land for survival, and closing his heart to the unpredictable ways of people. Yet, as he rode toward the unknown, he felt a stirring of something long buried, a sense that life could still surprise him, that courage and compassion might still define him, and that perhaps after years of loneliness he was about to meet someone who would change everything. The dust on the horizon had grown thicker, and John's pulse quickened. Something was happening out there, far beyond the quiet stretches of grass and the familiar hills he had come to know so well. From a distance he could make out shapes, horses galloping too fast for ordinary travel, and a carriage that seemed to struggle against them. The sight was unusual, and something in the rhythm of their movement made him uneasy. He knew the plains well enough to recognize normal travelers, settlers heading home, or traders making their way along the trails. But this was different. This was chaos. John spurred his horse forward, feeling the familiar weight of the saddle beneath him, the wind against his face, and the steady beat of hooves on the hard earth. Each moment brought him closer to the unknown, yet a strange clarity filled his mind. In all his years of solitude, he had grown cautious, wary of strangers. But this, whatever it was, felt urgent. The cries he now began to hear faintly on the wind made that urgency impossible to ignore. They were high-pitched, panicked, desperate. They belonged to someone in trouble. As he approached, the scene became clearer. Two men on horseback were struggling with something, or someone, near the carriage. Their movements were rough and hurried, their shouts carried across the prairie. John slowed his horse slightly, keeping to the tall grass on the edge of the trail. He observed carefully. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the ground, making every movement more dramatic, more frightening. The woman they were dragging appeared to be caught in some kind of struggle, her arms reaching out, her body twisting as if fighting against the strong hands holding her. John's chest tightened. For a moment, he simply watched, trying to understand the situation. The men were clearly intent on their goal, careless in their method and cruel in their actions. Yet he noticed the woman's determination. She struggled with all her might, refusing to give in, refusing to be defeated. That defiance stirred something in John that he had thought long dead. After years of isolation, after years of telling himself that the world was better left alone, he felt a fierce need to act. He could not stand by and watch someone suffer, not when he could do something. He spurred his horse again, moving closer but keeping low to the ground to avoid being seen. His mind raced, considering the options. He could yell, "Try to scare them off," but that might make the situation worse for the woman. He could wait for them to pass and follow them, but that risked losing them entirely. No, he realized, he needed to approach carefully, with precision and courage, just as he had learned to approach dangerous situations on the plains. Years of living alone had taught him patience, observation, and strategy. Now, all that training would be put to use. As he drew nearer, he noticed small details, the glint of sunlight on metal, the tense posture of the men, and the faint, frightened movements of the woman. Her hair was tangled, dust-covered, and her clothes torn in places. It was clear she had been struggling for some time, trying to escape whatever danger had trapped her. John felt a pang in his heart. He had seen suffering before, but rarely had it reached so close to him in such a vivid, immediate way. And now he knew he could not ignore it. He had to act. He slowed his horse to a careful trot, staying just out of sight behind a small rise in the land. From this vantage point, he could see the attackers more clearly. They were armed, though not heavily. Their confidence seemed to come from surprise and aggression rather than skill or strategy. John noticed the way they moved in tandem, attempting to control the woman, trying to force her toward the carriage. She resisted, and every now and then, her foot caught on a rock or a branch, sending her stumbling but never giving up entirely. It was a display of courage that struck John deeply. He remembered the years of solitude and loss he had endured. He thought about the nights alone, the endless skies, the quiet moments by the fire, and yet as he watched this woman fight for her life, he felt a connection, a recognition that courage and perseverance were not things he owned alone. They were universal, and in this moment they called to him. He could not stand by and remain a passive observer. The plains had given him skills, survival instincts, and strength. and now it was time to use them for something beyond himself. He took a deep breath, feeling the wind against his face, and guided his horse forward, carefully choosing the path that would bring him closest without alerting the attackers immediately. The distance closed quickly, the sound of hooves on the dry earth mingling with the woman's cries and the shouts of the men. Every nerve in his body was alert. He thought of the tactics he had used on the ranch, approaching wild animals, rescuing calves trapped in the mud, facing coyotes that threatened his herd. The principles were the same: patience, timing, and decisive action when the moment came. The men were focused on their task, unaware of the approaching figure. John's hand rested near his side, on the leather strap of his revolver, though he had no desire to use it unless absolutely necessary. He trusted in his own strength, his horsemanship, and his ability to surprise them. The woman's movements were becoming more frantic. She had almost been pulled to the ground by one of the men, but she twisted, freed herself momentarily, and tried to rise again. Her determination was remarkable, a raw display of human will that left John in awe. He spurred his horse slightly, moving faster now, closing the final distance. The men glanced up just in time to see him emerging from the shadows of the grass. For a brief moment, they were surprised, and that hesitation was enough. John called out, his voice strong and commanding, cutting across the noise of the plains. The sudden presence startled the men, breaking their rhythm. The woman seized the moment, gathering herself and trying to push free once more. John arrived beside the group, his horse rearing slightly as he positioned himself between the woman and her attackers. The men realized the danger too late, their confidence faltering in the face of unexpected resistance. John's eyes were sharp, his movements deliberate. Years of surviving on the plains had honed his reflexes, and now they were being tested in a situation far more urgent than fixing a fence or mending a roof. He called again, firmly, demanding they stop, making it clear that he was not a man to be trifled with. The woman, sensing an ally, continued her struggle, finally freeing one hand. John moved closer, positioning himself to protect her, ready to act if the attackers made a move. For a few tense moments, everything seemed suspended. The wind paused, the dust hung in the air, and time itself felt slower. The men exchanged glances, uncertainty replacing aggression. They had counted on surprise and dominance, but this new presence had shifted the balance. Finally, the attackers hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. John's gaze did not waver, his stance firm, signaling both strength and determination. He had no intention of letting the woman be harmed further. Slowly, cautiously, he edged forward, guiding her away from the immediate danger, keeping himself between her and the men. Each step was deliberate, measured, and careful, balancing speed with safety. The woman's trust was evident in the way she followed his lead, even as her body trembled with fear and exhaustion. By the time the men fully realized that they were being challenged, John had created a small gap between them and the woman. The moment of hesitation was enough. He pushed forward, urging her toward a safer path, and the attackers, seeing that their advantage had slipped away, made the decision to retreat for now. Their shouts faded in the distance, replaced by the sound of John's horse's hooves and the woman's ragged breathing. John finally slowed, coming to a halt in a small clearing. The woman, leaning against her rescuer for support, finally spoke, her voice shaky but filled with relief. She was safe, at least for the moment, and the immediate danger had passed. John dismounted, helping her to stand fully on her own. Dust covered both of them, their clothes torn and stained, but the relief in the air was tangible. The plains, once so quiet and predictable, had been momentarily filled with chaos, courage, and the unplanned collision of two lives. As the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in deep reds and purples. John looked at the woman in the fading light. She was exhausted but alive, and her eyes held a mix of fear, gratitude, and something else he could not immediately name. In that moment, he realized that the solitude he had embraced for so long was ending, that life had a way of reaching out to even the most isolated of hearts. And for the first time in many years, he felt that spark, the spark of purpose, connection, and the possibility that his life might change in ways he had never imagined. John McAllister could feel his heart pounding as he led the woman toward a small cluster of trees at the edge of the clearing. The immediate danger had passed, but he knew that the attackers might return at any moment. He kept one hand on his horse's reins and the other lightly resting on the hilt of his revolver, not because he wanted to use it, but because the presence of a weapon reminded him to stay alert. The woman, breathing heavily and covered in dust, leaned slightly on him for support. Her movements were cautious, careful, but she kept her head held high, as if refusing to show weakness. "Are you hurt badly?" John asked in a calm, steady voice, trying not to startle her. His eyes scanned the surrounding land constantly, alert to any sign of the men who had attacked her. I'm okay," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "Just sore. They tried to take me from the coach." Her words came out in short, uneven bursts, each one carrying the weight of fear and exhaustion. She paused, her chest heaving as she tried to calm herself. "Thank you for helping me." John nodded silently, a mixture of relief and concern washing over him. Words felt inadequate in this moment. Action, not speech, was what mattered. He guided her a few more steps until they reached a spot where the tall grass and small trees could provide cover. He dismounted carefully, keeping a watchful eye on the horizon. The woman mirrored his actions, moving slowly to avoid tripping over rocks and roots hidden in the grass. "Sit here for a moment," John said, pointing to a fallen log. The woman lowered herself gently, brushing dust from her clothes. He remained standing, scanning the surroundings, listening to the distant sounds of the prairie, the faint rustle of animals, the whisper of the wind, and the occasional bird call. Everything seemed calm now, but he knew better than to trust appearances. The attackers might return, and he needed to be ready. "You're very brave," John said finally, his voice softer this time. "Most people would have been too scared to fight back the way you did." The woman looked at him, a faint smile flickering across her dusty face. "I had no choice," she said quietly. "I couldn't let them take me. I had to fight." Her words carried strength, courage, and a spark of defiance that reminded John of why he had acted. It was not just duty or instinct. It was recognition of a spirit he could not ignore. For a moment they sat in silence, the tension slowly easing but never fully leaving. John knew they had to move, to put more distance between themselves and the attackers. He offered his hand, helping the woman to stand. She accepted it, and together they walked toward a nearby ridge that provided better visibility of the surrounding land. John's horse followed closely, sensing the quiet urgency of its rider. As they reached the ridge, John could see the coach in the distance, abandoned now, the attackers nowhere in sight. The wind carried faint sounds from the plains, horses whinnying, the creak of wheels, but no immediate threat. Yet John remained cautious. He knew the men would not give up easily. They had underestimated him, underestimated the woman's strength, and he suspected they would return with more force if given the chance. "Can you tell me what happened?" John asked gently, keeping his voice calm so as not to alarm her. "They stopped the coach suddenly," she explained, her words still trembling. "Two men jumped out from the trees. They demanded money, but I had none. Then they tried to drag me out. I fought. I screamed. Her voice broke slightly, and John placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You did the right thing by fighting, he said, and you're safe now. We'll make sure nothing happens again. She nodded, taking a deep breath to steady herself. The sun had set further, casting long shadows over the plains, turning the grass and trees into dark silhouettes. John knew that night would bring new dangers, but it also offered cover. He needed to get her to a place where they could rest, plan, and recover. Come on, he said finally. We'll head back to my ranch. It's not far, and you'll be safe there. I have food, water, and a place to sleep. You need rest. The woman hesitated for a moment, unsure if she could trust a stranger, but the honesty in his eyes convinced her. She nodded, and they began the walk down the ridge, careful to keep to the shadows and avoid open ground. The journey back was slow. The woman's legs were sore, and her body ached from the struggle. John supported her when she stumbled, his hand firm yet gentle. The night was quiet, except for the distant sounds of nature, owls calling, wind through the grass, and the occasional rustle of a small animal. Each sound made John's senses sharpen. He knew the attackers might be watching from afar, waiting for an opportunity to strike. Finally, after what felt like hours but was only part of the night, they reached the ranch. The familiar sight of his cabin, the warm glow of light from within, and the safety of the fenced land brought a sense of relief that John had not realized he would feel so strongly. He opened the door, letting the woman enter first, and then brought in his horse. The warmth of the cabin, the smell of wood smoke and old leather, and the quiet stillness of home surrounded them. You'll be safe here, John said again, guiding her to a chair near the fire. He went to fetch a blanket and a bowl of warm water. The woman accepted the comfort quietly, her hand shaking slightly as she sipped the water. John watched her carefully, noting every movement, every sign of exhaustion. He knew it would take time for her to fully recover, both physically and emotionally. Over the next few hours, John worked to tend to her wounds. There were no serious injuries, only bruises and scratches, but even minor wounds needed care. He cleaned them gently, applied salve, and wrapped them carefully. The woman winced, but did not complain, her courage still evident even in her pain. "You're very kind," she said finally, looking at him with gratitude. Most people wouldn't have stopped, wouldn't have cared. John shrugged slightly, brushing it off, but inside he felt a quiet pride. He had acted because it was right, because he could not ignore someone in need. The choice had been simple, even if the consequences were unknown. As the night deepened, they spoke quietly. The woman introduced herself as Aylin, an Apache woman traveling to visit family in another settlement. She spoke of her life with honesty and courage, recounting stories of survival, community, and respect for the land. John listened intently, fascinated by her knowledge of the plains and the skills she had learned from her people. He realized that she was not only brave but wise, resourceful, and strong in ways he had rarely seen. In turn, John shared parts of his life, carefully omitting the deepest wounds for now. He spoke of his ranch, his daily routines, the years of solitude, and the challenges of surviving on the open plains. Aylin listened with interest, occasionally asking questions, showing a genuine curiosity about the life of a man who had chosen to live alone for so long. The conversation flowed naturally, creating a quiet bond that began to bridge the gap between their very different experiences. Hours passed, and eventually, Aylin's eyelids grew heavy. John offered her a place to sleep on a clean bed in a spare room, where she could rest safely and recover from the day's events. She accepted, finally allowing herself to relax, and John watched her for a moment before closing the door gently. The cabin was quiet once more, except for the crackling of the fire. John sat by the fire, reflecting on the day's events. He had not realized how much the experience had stirred him. The thrill of the chase, the tension of the confrontation, and the satisfaction of helping someone in need had awakened feelings he had long buried. For years he had told himself that solitude was enough, that life beyond the ranch was dangerous and uncertain. Yet now he realized that connection, courage, and compassion were also essential to living fully. Outside, the wind whispered through the plains, carrying with it the faint scent of sage and the distant sound of night creatures. John knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, that the attackers might return, and that Aelin would need continued protection. But for the first time in many years, he felt that life held possibilities beyond the fences of his ranch, beyond the endless solitude. He had acted when it mattered, and that action had created a bond he could not ignore. As the fire burned low and the cabin grew quiet, John allowed himself a small, rare smile. The night had been long, frightening, and exhausting, yet it had also brought a moment of clarity. Courage and kindness mattered. Action could make a difference, and even a life spent in solitude could intersect with another in ways that changed everything. He knew that the story was far from over, but for now, there was safety, there was warmth, and there was the quiet understanding that he had done the right thing. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, spilling golden light across the plains and illuminating the McAllister Ranch. The air was crisp and fresh, carrying the scent of dew and wild grass. John McAllister stood on the porch of his cabin, leaning against the wooden railing, watching as Aelin moved among the horses and cattle. She had settled into the rhythms of ranch life remarkably quickly, and it was clear that her presence had brought new energy to the once quiet place. The bond between them had grown steadily over the weeks. Aelin had become more than a guest. She was a companion, a trusted ally, and a friend who shared both the labor and the joys of the land. John had long thought that solitude was all he needed, that life on the ranch could exist without human connection. Yet now he realized that it was not merely companionship he had found. It was shared purpose. The work they did together, the challenges they faced, and the small victories each day brought a sense of fulfillment he had not known in years. Aelin had brought her own knowledge and skills to the ranch, teaching John ways to better understand the land, the animals, and the plants that grew wild around them. She knew how to track animals, read the skies for changing weather, and identify plants with healing properties. John listened intently, fascinated by her insights, and slowly began to adopt some of her methods alongside his own. Their routines began to intertwine, creating a rhythm of work and care that strengthened both the ranch and their bond. One morning, as they worked together to mend a section of fence, John paused and looked at Aelin. She was focused, strong, and confident, her hands steady as she tied the ropes and hammered the posts into place. The wind carried her hair across her face, and she smiled briefly at him, a smile that spoke of shared understanding and quiet joy. For a moment, John allowed himself to feel the depth of the connection they had forged, the trust and respect that had grown between them. "You've made a big difference here," he said softly, almost to himself. "I didn't think anyone could. I didn't think I'd ever have someone like you around." His words stumbled slightly, unpracticed in the quiet vulnerability of admitting emotion, but Aelin understood. She nodded, her expression calm but filled with warmth. "We've both learned a lot," she replied simply. "I've learned that the world can be harsh, but it can also be kind. And you You've shown me that courage and strength can come from unexpected places." Her words were honest, carrying a sincerity that touched John deeply. In her, he had found someone who recognized not just his skills, but his heart. The seasons continued to change, each bringing new work and new challenges. Spring brought fresh growth across the plains, calves and foals that required careful tending, and the planting of crops to supplement the ranch's resources. Summer brought heat, long hours in the sun, and the constant need to manage water and pasture. Autumn painted the landscape in gold and red, a reminder of the passage of time, and winter tested their endurance with cold winds, heavy snow, and the careful rationing of supplies. Through it all, John and Island worked side by side, sharing the burdens and celebrating the small successes. Their bond deepened not only through work, but through conversation and quiet moments. By the fire in the evenings, they shared stories of their pasts. John of his family and the life he had lost, Island of her travels, her people, and the lessons she had learned from her family and community. They laughed together at small, everyday moments, and sometimes, in the quiet of the night, they simply sat in companionable silence, feeling the warmth of the fire and the closeness of another human being. For John, these moments were unfamiliar, but welcome, a balm to the years of loneliness he had endured. News of John's bravery and Island's survival eventually reached the nearby towns. Some people expressed admiration for his courage, recognizing that he had acted without hesitation to save someone in danger. Others were curious, cautious, or even skeptical about the unusual partnership that had formed between a lone rancher and an Apache woman. John, however, paid little attention to gossip or judgment. He had learned long ago that the opinions of others were fleeting and often misguided. What mattered was the life he was building here, in the open plains, with someone who shared his values, his sense of purpose, and his respect for the land. One afternoon, as John and Aylin tended to a section of the pasture, a group of travelers passed nearby. They paused briefly, exchanging greetings, and one of them remarked on the improvement in the ranch's appearance. John smiled, a quiet satisfaction in his chest, while Aylin nodded politely. They continued their work without hesitation, knowing that the life they had built was theirs alone, shaped by effort, trust, and shared courage. Even in moments of challenge, their teamwork was evident. When a sudden storm approached one afternoon, they worked together to secure the livestock and reinforce the fences. Rain fell in heavy sheets, lightning flashing across the sky, but inside the sturdy barn, they managed to keep the animals safe and dry. Later, as they watched the storm pass, John realized that their combined skills and determination had transformed the ranch into a place of safety and stability, something he had once thought impossible on his own. Over time, the boundaries between survival and comfort began to blur. The cabin, once a place of solitude and silence, became filled with laughter, conversation, and the small signs of daily life shared between two people who had once been strangers. Meals were shared, chores divided, and plans made for the future of the ranch. John found that he no longer feared connection or the uncertainties of life beyond the fences. Instead, he embraced them, understanding that companionship did not weaken him, it strengthened him. Island, too, flourished in this environment. She had faced danger, fear, and uncertainty, yet here she found a place where her skills were valued, her courage respected, and her presence welcomed. She had once been forced to rely solely on herself, but now she shared her knowledge and experience with someone who trusted her completely. The sense of partnership brought a new dimension to her life, one that balanced independence with collaboration, strength with compassion. In the quiet evenings, as the sun set and the sky filled with stars, John and Island would sit on the porch, watching the plains stretch out endlessly before them. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with understanding, respect, and a shared history that had grown from an extraordinary moment of crisis. They had faced danger, uncertainty, and fear together, and in doing so, had built a foundation of trust and friendship that could endure anything the world might bring. John reflected on the years he had spent alone, the grief he had carried, and the life he had thought was over. He realized that those years of solitude had not been wasted. They had prepared him to act decisively, to value courage and kindness, and to recognize the importance of human connection. Island had not only survived because of his actions, she had also taught him about resilience, wisdom, and the strength that comes from facing the world together rather than apart. The ranch continued to thrive, a testament to their combined efforts and determination. Crops flourished, cattle were healthy, and the land, once a symbol of isolation and struggle, became a place of hope and growth. The work was never easy, and there were still challenges: harsh weather, unexpected problems, and the occasional visitor from the town. But together they faced each obstacle with patience, skill, and a quiet confidence that came from mutual respect. By the time the first snows of winter arrived, the ranch was secure and strong. John and Aylin had weathered storms, healed wounds, and built a life that was richer than either had imagined. Their partnership had transformed not only the ranch, but their understanding of what it meant to live fully. They had learned that courage, compassion, and trust were not simply responses to danger, they were the foundations of life itself. As they stood together on the porch one cold morning, watching the plains stretch out under a blanket of white, John realized that the world had given him a second chance. Not a chance to undo the past, but a chance to live again, to care for someone, and to be cared for in return. Island's presence had brought warmth, hope, and meaning to a life he had long thought lost to grief and solitude. He turned to her and spoke quietly, words carrying both truth and gratitude. "I never thought I'd find this, not after everything I've lost. But with you, I see that life can still be good, still be full of purpose." Island smiled, the cold wind tousling her hair. "We found it together," she said simply. "The land, the work, and each other, that's enough." John nodded, feeling a peace he had not known in decades. The plains stretched endlessly before them, wild and untamed, yet safe and familiar in a way that only years of living on the land could create. Together they faced the world, not as strangers, not as solitary figures, but as partners, friends, and survivors. The ranch, once a symbol of loneliness, had become a place of life, trust, and connection.